The Meze Empyrean has been around for a while now, but there's a lot more competition on the market. So how does it hold up? Hey, I'm DMS, you're watching the Headphone Show, and today we're talking about the Meze Empyrean. This is not a cheap headphone. In fact, it's in the ballpark of $3,000. So you would think, well, $3,000, this must be an incredible headphone, right? Well, in some ways, yes, and in some ways, not so much. Let's get started with building comfort. Now, this headphone's been around long enough, you've probably heard it before, but this headphone is very, very comfortable, especially for its weight. Now, that doesn't mean I can wear it forever, because I can't. After a while, its weight still does get to me, but there is nothing in this class that is quite as comfortable as the Empyrean. The pads are large, they're ear-shaped, and they're soft. The headband is nice and springy, but not too clampy. The suspension strap is firm and caves in on the sides where it's necessary, so I get pretty solid contact all the way down to the edges, and this means that I don't get a hot spot right on top in the middle. It's pretty evenly balanced all around. And all things considered, I think they made this headphone about as light as they could, given the size of the construction. The ear cups have a pretty wide range of tilt and turn, and can adjust pretty far up and down with a friction mount. And this friction mechanism actually holds its place pretty well. It's not one of those where you just put it on and it starts to slide out of place. It actually seems to hold its place. The pads are very easy to remove since they're magnetically connected, and Meze does also have vegan pad options. And man, anywhere you look on this headphone, it is beautifully constructed. I'll mention this some more times in the video, especially around the conclusions, but the takeaway in build and comfort is that this is absolutely a $3,000 build and comfort headphone. Really, there isn't anything in the build or comfort that I can complain about, and Meze have definitely made something that, as far as build is concerned, defines its own level of craftsmanship. But it isn't all perfect. So with that said, let's talk about subjective sound, and then we'll get into frequency response afterwards. This has a very unique driver in it. The Planar in this headphone basically uses different sections of the membrane to produce different frequencies of sound. It's almost like having a multi-driver speaker, but it's still full range. This results in one of the most unique looking Planar drivers I've ever laid my eyes on. And uniqueness can breed some very good things for the sound, but it can also have its drawbacks. There's probably reasons why people haven't done this specific design before, or at least not in a way that has ever been really popular. There are some things Empyrean does really well in sound, and one of those things is bass. In fact, the one thing I enjoyed this headphone more than anything else with was watching movies. It extends deep, it rumbles, it shakes, and the bass is both very full and round sounding. The bass is also the most exaggerated part of this headphone's entire frequency spectrum. If you're a bass head, you'll probably like the tuning of this thing because it is what I would describe as a refined bass head's headphone. This trend continues through the mid-range, and we get a pretty decent amount of mid-range texture and warmth, but sometimes vocals do sound a bit bloated. Not boomy, but almost so. As we move through the upper mids and the treble, a lot of it does sound recessed, and it sounds like there's a hole scooped out somewhere in the frequency, which we'll talk about a little bit more in frequency response itself. But then as we get farther into the upper treble in the air, well, we get back into a realm where that treble is present, if not sometimes bright, though generally not so. And overall, it doesn't sound bad, but the big thing that suffers here is timbre. A lot of things related to both vocals and instruments don't sound quite as natural as they should. Things like orchestral music sound like they're in a very warm and boomy room, but the presence of the strings is lost in the translation. The upper mid-range and lower treble sometimes sounds like the vocalist has a rag in front of their mouth. We get the bass, we get the upper treble, but something right in here is just lost. Kind of like how on radio shows they used to super heavily EQ someone's voice to make them sound really boomy and bright. You get a similar effect with these on some tracks. And not all the time, because there are plenty of times I listen to the Empyrean and think, wow, this sounds great. But for every time I've listened to it and thought this sounds great, I've also listened to it and thought, well, something here just isn't quite right. Luckily, Empyrean does make up for it in terms of soundstage, because the stage is very, very realistic. And not only that, the thing that impressed me the most was vertical placement. There are times where sounds will go like this. That's a great little kind of impression there. You like that? Sounds will go from the bottom to the top, and you can physically hear the sound moving from the bottom to the top. That is impressive considering this is a 2-channel setup. And we're not talking about a Dolby Atmos recording, we're talking about a regular song. That is a very unique trait that I've heard on very few headphones, and that translates into other realms as well, like gaming. Someone is walking nearby you, well, it sounds like someone is walking nearby you. Things like gunshots and explosions do sound a little bit weird, though certainly very enjoyable with this headphone's bass. And there have been times, especially on binaural recordings, where I listen to a song and am surprised by something that I thought has been coming from the room around me when it's actually been in the headphones. But I'm not quite sure if the sacrifice in timbre and naturalness, the overall tonal balance, is worth that. That's going to be something that's going to vary from person to person. But it doesn't quite stop there, because this headphone is also not quite as detailed as things at its price point. In fact, it's not quite as detailed as things that are half the price. The headphone I'm going to draw comparisons to here is the Aria Stealth. It is a headphone that is more tonally balanced, has better overall timbre, not as exciting in the bass, not as exciting in the soundstage, but is definitely more detailed. That's where things get tough. I have more to say about that, and I'll save it for the conclusions of this video, but it really is going to be about what you prioritize. So with that said, let's talk about frequency response, and then I'll move into my conclusions on this headphone. Frequency response here is no surprise. You can see it compared to the HD6XX. This is a bassy and warm headphone, and it has some recesses in the upper mid-range and in the treble. It measures like it sounds, but it does sound like there's more of a scoop than there actually shows in these graphs. If you're an objectivist, the Stealth is definitely a no-brainer over the Empyrean, but not just for subjectivists. I really do think that the Aria Stealth is kind of a better option in a lot of cases, unless the Empyrean's specific sonic strengths are something that you're chasing after. While the frequency response can tell us a story about this headphone, it definitely doesn't tell us all the technicalities that make it unique and make it special. And with a brief frequency response section out of the way, I want to talk about the conclusions of this headphone. After I finished drawing up my conclusions for this headphone, I talked to a fellow reviewer, Golden Sound. And what he said is that this headphone has the build and comfort of a $5,000 headphone with the sound of a $1,000 headphone, which makes it fairly priced right at $3,000. And in some ways, I would agree with that. I think that the soundstage and bass performance are definitely better than those at the $1,000 or even the $1,500 mark. But the timbre tuning and detail definitely are that of a $1,000 headphone. Once again, the build is definitely that of a headphone far more expensive than $3,000. It is definitely a headphone for someone who wants to just buy a very comfortable, high-end audiophile headphone who's going to enjoy the bass, enjoy the soundstage, and not think too much about the fine details. I mean, after all, it's not a grainy headphone. And it's definitely a massive step up from consumer headphones or a lot of things in the sub-$1,000 price points. But I also think if this is the only headphone in your collection, a lot of hardcore audiophiles are probably going to be disappointed by its shortcomings. So this is my recommendation. If the strengths of the Empyrean sound like something that you really want, go for it. It is a good headphone. I'd also recommend having some other things in your collection too to switch back and forth between so you can make up for, well, its shortcomings. And if you just want a really good all-around high-end headphone, honestly, save a little bit of money. Go for the Aria Stealth. I think the Aria Stealth, while not as good in soundstage, while not as well built as this, it checks a lot more boxes. And as an overall package, it is more well-rounded. And all of that isn't to say the Empyrean's a bad headphone, because it's not. This headphone's been around for several years now, and it has gotten praise again and again and again between shows and other reviewers. And I definitely think this headphone has earned its place at its price point. But whether or not it's worth it, that's going to be up to you. And one more note I want to put on that, which is amplification and pairing. If you do decide to buy this headphone, it's actually not super amp dependent. Some things do sound a bit more harsh in the upper mid-range, which is interesting considering that region is recessed. I wasn't as much of a fan of it with shit brand amplifiers. I did like it more with things that were Class A, things that were THX topping, or things that I like to recommend like the Theo K9 Pro. But in the case of this headphone, that was also interchangeable with things like the topping A90. Do you need to buy the highest end amplifier to get the most out of this headphone? Absolutely not. It is not super hard to drive. It's average for most Planars. If something can drive a Sundara or drive an Aria, it can drive this just fine. And the detail, while good, is not going to be crazy enough to really require a high-end amplifier. And there are some cases of amplifiers I heard here that made this headphone stand out even more so, but those amps also tend to make every headphone stand out. I think that's probably more of a testament to the amplifiers than it is to the headphone. So guys, that is going to wrap this one up. Meze Empyrean, a pretty solid headphone. Let me know in the comments if you think this headphone is right for you, but otherwise leave a like if you liked this video. Let me know what you want to see in the future. If you want to get active in the forums, you can at the link in the video description, where this headphone will also be linked, as well as the other headphones I talked about in this video. As always, don't forget to stick around and subscribe for more videos like this in the future. Until next one, guys. Peace.